Hello, I'm Sunderland Echo reporter Tony Gillen, and this is a celebration of Marvellous Mackems, people from or with links to Wearside who have notably enriched the world we live in.
Eileen O'Shaughnessy is possibly someone that you haven't heard of, but you will have heard of her husband, George Orwell. And her connection with Sunderland is that she went to school here. She was born in South Shields and her parents sent her to Sunderland Church High School, the fee-paying school that many people will remember in Sunderland. She was very passionate about English and she won a scholarship to go to Oxford University to study English. Now, Oxford at that time had only been allowing women to graduate for 2 years prior to that. They didn't really allow women to gain first-class honours degrees in the way that we would do now in terms of merit. It was in terms of how many they were going to allow rather than how good they were. And she graduated with an upper second, which meant she couldn't do what she wanted to do, which was go into academia. She tried teaching and hated it. She set herself up as a typist and set up a typing agency, which she was actually quite enthusiastic about. She was typing manuscripts for people. And she also was working as a freelance journalist. About 10 years after she had started Oxford in 1934, she decided to go back to university and do a master's in psychology. It was at a party in 1934 held by a friend that she made on that course that she met a struggling young writer called Eric Blair. And at this party, they hit it off really well together. And after the party, Eric said to one of his friends that this is the girl he was going to marry. And Eric is the person who we know as George Orwell. So Eric and Eileen, or George and Eileen, married the following year, and she went with him to Barcelona when he fought in the Spanish Civil War in early 1936. She is responsible for ensuring he didn't die at that point. He was very badly injured, very famously shot through his neck. And she made sure he received adequate medical attention and also helped smuggle him out of the country when he fell onto the wrong side of the communist factions that were fighting at that point. And as I said, she had a typing agency and she was the one who was typing up all of his manuscripts. And we know from the original versions of those manuscripts that she edited them. She added her own ideas to them. And in her letters to her friends, she talks about how her husband was unable to read her handwriting at one point and on a manuscript, and she was having to rewrite it for him. In the Second World War, they moved from their dilapidated cottage in Oxfordshire to live in central London, and they both worked for the BBC. Eileen also worked for the Ministry of Information. We know from letters that they wrote that Eileen is the one who is responsible for Animal Farm being written as an animal sort of analogy, and it's because at the point that Orwell was writing this rant about communism, the Soviet Union were the allies of Britain. So no publishers were willing to take on a book that was really criticising the Soviet Union. So Eileen suggested it was written as an animal fable, which is how we now know it. Everybody knows about George Orwell and his problem with TB. That's the thing that killed him in 1950. Eileen herself, though, was very ill a lot of the time. She had what we think was cervical cancer. And she went into hospital in 1945 to have a hysterectomy. At that point, Orwell was reporting on the American liberation of Paris. He wasn't even in the country at the time. And Eileen came back up to Newcastle for the operation because it was cheaper than London London surgeons. Unfortunately, the surgeon who was responsible for her operation was quite negligent, and he didn't test her for anemia before she had the anaesthetic. and she actually died before she got to the operating table because she wasn't strong enough to sustain the anaesthetic. And this really affected Orwell. They had been planning to move with their adopted son Richard. They'd been planning to move to the island of Jura so that he could concentrate on his writing in the aftermath of the Second World War. And Eileen was someone who had been very, very supportive of him. She had really forsaken her own career for Orwell. He went to live in Jura and finished 1984 whilst living up there with their son Richard. It wasn't called 1984 though when he first sent it to the publisher. It was called The Last Man in Europe. His American publisher didn't like the title, so sent it back to him and said, come up with another title. And he responded with the title 1984. Now, no one has ever really got to the bottom of why he called it 1984. A lot of people have assumed that because the manuscript was submitted in 1948, he simply transposed the last two numbers to make it 84. Anyone who has written a book will know that a title is never that arbitrary. What we do know, though, is that Eileen in 1934 was part of an edited collection of stories and reminiscences about Sunderland Church High School. The school was celebrating its 50th anniversary, its Golden Jubilee, and they wrote to all the old girls asking them to contribute something for a special edition of the school magazine. And most of those contributions were reminiscences of time at school or fictional works of creative writing. Eileen, however, contributed a poem, and her poem was about the 50-year history of the school from the point of view of a girl looking back. She then brought it up to date for 1934, and it was quite a pessimistic future that she was looking at because Eileen was very worried about the rise of fascism. So she then wrote 50 years in the future and how things could be better in the future if we only got over this dystopian present. She called the poem 1984. And that's the only other poem, the only thing we know that is called 1984 is Eileen's poem, which has a lot of similarities with George Orwell and his own book 1984. That link back to the school's Golden Jubilee in 1934 is something we can perhaps link to one of the best known novels of the 20th century, 1984.
The word genius is among the most overused and misused in today's English language. It is routinely applied to musicians, sports stars, actors, comedians, or just about anyone who might more accurately be described as very good, talented, or even competent. Along with genius as a cluster of cheapening hyperbole, we have amazing and incredible. When such descriptions are applied to someone because they have balanced a tray of drinks on their head or Britain's got nothing better to do, it does little for the reputation of someone like William Herschel, 1738 to 1822. This is because Herschel truly was a genius whose accomplishments are genuinely both amazing and incredible. He is best remembered for astronomy, which is the study of the stars, planets, the galaxy and so forth, as opposed to astrology, which is the study of one being born every minute. His discoveries include infrared radiation and the planet Uranus. He founded sidereal astronomy, which is measuring time according to the position of the stars. Increased our understanding of nebulae, which is giant gas and dust clouds in space. Greatly improved the telescope and made his own eyepieces, the strongest with a magnifying power of 6,450. This was the sort of thing he could do before he'd eaten his shreddies. He had a brain the size of Witherwack. In addition to a pile of other scientific achievements that I can't even begin to understand, he was an accomplished musician and composer of 24 symphonies, 14 concertos and various other pieces for a range of instruments. Although born in Hanover, he was appointed as an astronomer by George III and knighted in 1816. A busy lad and clever or what? Patrick Moore described William Herschel as the first man to give a reasonably correct picture of the shape of our star system or galaxy, the best telescope maker of his time, and possibly the greatest observer who ever lived. Were it not for his German origins, Herschel might well be on a banknote. And now for the punchline. He lived in Sunderland. It's why his English was so good. In the 1760s, he resided in various lodgings in what is now Sunnyside. It was in Sunderland that he resumed his interest in mathematics and composed 6 of his symphonies. His Symphony No. 8 in C minor is sometimes referred to as the Sunderland Symphony. When he left Wearside, he remained unbeaten in the domino handicap in Sam's Bar, a nearby tavern. Fair enough, we made that last bit up to capture your attention, but the rest of it and other remarkable stuff besides is all completely true. What's odd is that most people in Sunderland now don't seem to know that he was ever even here. This seems anomalous and something easily and inexpensively rectifiable. If this city has any sort of drum to bang, then it should be banged. It doesn't take a genius to work that out. In Slough in Berkshire, where he also lived and is actually buried, a school, a street, a pub and a car park are named after him. Other streets are similarly named in his honour in Manchester, Cambridge, Oxford, Didcot in Oxfordshire, Biggleswade in Bedfordshire, Bradford, Brisbane and Paris. There is a dedicated Herschel museum in Bath, where there is also a hospital laboratory named after him, plus a university building in Newcastle upon Tyne, a telescope in the Canaries, and an observatory in Brazil. At the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, his statue stands next to those of Isaac Newton, Copernicus, Galileo, Hipparchus, and Kepler. In Sunderland, where he lived, now, in space, an asteroid is named after him, as well as a crater on the Moon, a star in the constellation Cepheus, an impact basin on Mars, and a gap in the rings of Saturn. So it can be reasonably contended that William Herschel is better known on Saturn than in Sunderland. What does a bloke have to do to get a blue plaque around here? There is one blue plaque here in Sunnyside. It's dedicated to Charles Alcock. He's the Sunderland man who created the FA Cup. Mr. Alcock deserves his blue plaque too. But more than William Herschel, one of the greatest scientific minds in all of human history.
I think what we perhaps have forgotten is that Sunderland has a very militant history in terms of equal rights for people. And this was particularly in the 19th century, all the way through the 19th century, there were campaigners against racism, against slavery. One of the best known is a man called Celestine Edwards. And Celestine Edwards was born into a family of freed slaves in Dominica in 1858 or 59. He was the youngest of 10 children. And as soon as he could, he escaped to sea to get away from this huge family where he was being bullied by some of his older brothers. He was French speaking but learnt English on the ship that he got onto at the age of 16 and somehow or other managed to find his way to Edinburgh. After he got off the ship, stopped being a sailor and started to be a building labourer. And he lived in Edinburgh for about a year, then moved to Sunderland. He had another change of career when he moved to Sunderland and became an insurance agent and actually earned quite a good wage for that. He lived in one of the boarding houses that was in the area that we have as Sunnyside. They were all demolished in about the beginning of the 20th century. Sunderland is the only place he lived for any length of time. He was a passionate speaker in terms of Christianity, particularly Methodism, so temperance. He was a member of the temperance movement. He was a passionate speaker about Pan-Africanism, so the big African family that had spread across the globe, largely through enslavement. And of course, he was the grandson of enslaved people. He was a proponent of anti-racism. He spoke very passionately about how Darwin's work on evolution was making people from Africa appear that they were closely related to apes, and it was being used in a very racist way in a lot of literature at this point. He was very famous as a speaker. He would attract huge crowds to his public speaking events around the country. When he spoke in Sunderland, he spoke in the Assembly Hall, which was on the corner of St Thomas's Street and Fawcett Street, which is used to be the HSBC Bank, which is now flats. But that was the site of the Assembly Hall. He was someone who travelled around a lot. He didn't stay in any place for any long time, but he did come back to Sunderland and basically lived here for the best part of 3 years. He eventually moved to London and he became the editor of 2 different Christian magazines. And as such, he becomes the first black editor in Britain. He never really stopped. He was running around all over giving very passionate speeches about temperance, about anti-racism, about Pan-Africanism. His doctor, because he was quite ill at one point, his doctor said, "Stop, calm down, make sure you look after yourself." And of course he didn't. And he became very ill. He was found in an unconscious state after giving one particular talk in London. So he decided to go back to his family in Dominica, and he died 6 months later. He died at the age of just 34, but he was a very striking figure. Everyone would recognise him. He was 6 feet tall and was a very passionate wearer of very tall top hats. So he would tower over people, and a very imposing speaker. But I think we should be very proud of the fact that we have someone like Celestine Edwards who chose to live in Sunderland while he was resident in the United Kingdom.
Now, lest you imagine that Wayside has merely played host as a procession of marvellous men and women from other parts of the world milled through on their paths to glory, we can confirm the presence of native-born Mackems of some key moments in world history. The following selection of local heroes, whose lives have been a little less sumptuously documented than the marquee names, have been brought to the attention of the Sunderland Echo and my fellow reporter there, Chris Cordner, by historian Derek Holcroft. Did you know that a Sunderland genius was one of the undercover heroes who cracked German codes during the Second World War? Joseph Gillis did vital work at Bletchley Park, once the top secret home, which was the principal Allied base for codebreakers. Joseph attended Bede School in Sunderland before going off to Cambridge University, then becoming a lecturer in pure maths at Belfast's Queen's University. Gillis broke the codes in which Germans sent their weather reports, important to the Air Force's campaign. Another Sunderland man had the honour of guarding one of the most famous figures in British military history. Not only that, he did it while he was still a teenager. Leslie Sproxton was only 19 years old when he became a personal bodyguard to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Before joining the army, Leslie worked in the booking office at Seaburn Station and was expecting to go back to the post. Monty, the man who led the Allies in the Battle of El Alamein in the Second World War, was on a visit to Paris in 1949, and Lance Corporal Sproxton was part of a team of officers who had to create a security screen around him. The Sunderland Echo carried a report which modestly read, "Wayside national serviceman with the much-envied army job is Lance Corporal Leslie Sproxton." Waysider Bernard Remington played a huge part in the development of radar, yet almost no one was aware of it. You might say his work went undetected. Radar. Please yourselves. Bernard will still be remembered by a number of Sunderland folk of a certain vintage at the time of this recording, though perhaps more by the name Mr. Remington, as he was a teacher at schools in Sunderland, including Southmoor, in the 1960s. He was in at the beginning of research into radar, according to a 1946 report in the Sunderland Daily Echo and Shipping Gazette. Radar was the vital system which was key to Britain's success in defending its skies against the Nazis. Bernard was awarded the British Empire Medal in 1946 in recognition of his work. The resident of Neil Street went back to being a teacher, and Derek Holcroft was one of his pupils in the 1960s. Derek said that Bernard's heroics describe a hidden tale that none of his pupils ever knew. Ida and Louise Cook were sisters whose book royalties, love of opera and sheer nerve helped make them war heroes and lifesavers. Among the honours bestowed upon them were British Hero of the Holocaust Award and the Righteous Among the Nations Award, an honour presented by Israel to non-Jews who risked their own lives during the Holocaust to save Jews from extermination. When you add to this that they were from Sunderland and lived on Croft Avenue next to the Chester's pub, it begins to sound like the tallest of tales, but like all the best stories, it's entirely true. As the elder girl, Louise was the first to pass her clerical exams and became a secretary, earning £2 and 6 shillings a week at the Board of Education. Ida followed 2 years later. Typing away in London about a century ago, they became obsessed with opera after Louise heard a phonograph. she spent a dizzying £23 on a wind-up gramophone. But recorded music, especially then, has never matched live sound, so they saved what they could to attend performances. Extraordinary scrimming enabled them to sail third class to New York in December 1926, where they saw Amelita Galli-Curci in Verdi's La Traviata. Galli-Curci would become a friend in the days before stalking was a consideration. The Cook's opera obsession meant they needed more money to fund their trips to the great opera houses of Europe. Ida stumbled upon a very profitable new line of work. She had written about their real adventures and sold the stories. This would lead to a highly successful and profitable career as a romantic novelist for Mills and Boon, writing as Mary Burchell. The first of her 112 novels was published in 1936. The mention of female romantic novelists of the period draws inevitable comparisons with Barbara Cartland, a far better known writer and commercially incredibly successful. However, whereas Cartland remains a quite ridiculous figure in the eyes of many and a caricature of herself, Ida Cook seems anything but. Ida was also a far superior writer. Yet writing was a means to an end, and opera remained her first love. Saving people from the Holocaust is what Ida and Louise are best remembered for. But it was the combination of novel writing, opera and bottomless charm which serendipitously combined to help them save the lives of 29 Jews. In 1934, a year after Hitler took over Germany, an Austrian conductor called Clemens Krauss introduced them to a Jewish woman who, for obvious reasons, wished to move to Britain. The woman was Frau Meyer-Lisman, a lecturer who gave talks on opera. The introduction led to the sisters doing what they could before World War II began in 1939. They felt compelled to help the desperate and went to extreme lengths to do so. In order to communicate with both the German authorities and refugees, Louise taught herself German. They smuggled very valuable jewellery out of Germany by hiding it in plain sight, wearing expensive brooches, pearls and the like as though they were ephemeral knickknacks bought from Jackie White's market. Guards assumed it was all fake. They also sewed the labels of cheap British brands onto expensive furs. Imagine buying a Chanel handbag and having to pretend it was a genuine Topshop. These items, which mainly belonged to Jews, were then smuggled into Britain. This was necessary, as without some financial guarantee, refugees were not allowed into Britain. Had the Cooks been caught by the Nazi guards inspecting the trains they travelled on, they could have been executed. But they had the added advantage of being a familiar and accepted sight at Cologne Airport, just two English opera nuts who liked travelling around Europe. In the event of someone realising the jewellery was real, Ida's cover story would have been, "We were two nervous British spinsters who didn't trust our families at home, so when we went abroad we took all our jewellery with us." Before their first opera-chasing trip into mainland Europe, the Cook sisters didn't know any Jews. And they were unaware of what being a Jew actually entailed in Germany post-1933. Ida and Louise were unable to save any more lives after Germany invaded Poland in 1939, forcing Britain to declare war and making cultural trips to Germany impossible. As mentioned at the start of this piece, the Cook sisters were honoured for their achievements. In 1956, Ida Cook became an early subject of the TV show This Is Your Life. In 2017, a blue plaque was finally installed to commemorate them on Croft Avenue. However, while the well-connected yet somewhat ludicrous figure that was Barbara Cartland was given a damehood, the Cook sisters received no such honour. Ida died in 1986, Louise in 1991. Their honour is the esteem in which they are held, and their story, had it been presented to a Hollywood producer, would have been turned down like a bedspread for being just too far-fetched. Yet, it's completely true. And it all began here in Sunderland, right next to the Chesters.